Hello there, and welcome to The Value of Everything. Sorry, it's been a very long while since I have presented any podcast. I am pleased to bring with me the council communist Michael Acuña. He's an amazing academic, and I just thought it would be a very good thing to touch base with him, go through basically the past 5 years, because I haven't really done any video, haven't discussed anything that's happened, and quite a few events have transpired. So, welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Charles. I'm glad to be back.
Thank you. Yeah, so we were having a little tiny chat just beforehand, just trying to get ourselves set up. But this time round, I think I gave you a little bit of an itinerary of the five main topics, but we'll kick off with the one that's going to probably just going to get us instantly shadow banned and probably close off my channel straight away. So yeah, let's say the first one. I mean, I guess the only thing I can say is that maybe try and talk from your own perspective. Yeah, maybe not try and make some very harsh statements towards certain things, but other than that, I don't know. I don't know how we're going to get around this, right? Yeah. So, how, let me know your thoughts on the pandemic.
Yeah, so that was an interesting moment in history. I have a lot of thoughts on it, actually, Charles. I was actually dismayed by how that played out in many ways, especially politically, because it did take on a partisan dimension that I'm sure you noticed as well.
Yeah.
And what I found most intriguing by it was how so many ostensibly left wing individuals, organizations got behind the hegemonic position on the question. So, lockdowns, vaccinations, etc.,
Yeah.
which
So
was disheartening
well,
in many ways.
you'd expect a lot of, I would expect from. See, I would say, like, as I'm a little bit more on the libertarian side of things, I probably would have been, leaning a little bit more to the left wing around the Bush era sort of thing, right? And I would expect, even in those days, right, a lot of the left leaning side were somewhat questionable of the medical establishment and most establishments by the government, right? And
Exactly.
a lot of, from a communist perspective, there's a lot of classical philosophy that's going in there. The Hippocratic Oath. Does anybody recall those parts?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
People have very limited historical understandings, and I really do believe that at the end of the day, it came down to which side first promoted which perspective. So, since it became evident that the right was starting to coalesce around the position of uh, opposition to lockdowns, vaccine skepticism, etc., anyone who was even vaguely associated with the left had this knee-jerk reaction that they had to take the opposite position, if
yeah, that
only
was
to
interesting. Yeah,
signal their loyalty.
yeah. So from America, from the America perspective, that was very interesting to see that play out.
Yeah,
I mean, all right, let me just take it back. By the way, to the audience, Michael and I haven't discussed any of this. This is, for all I know, Michael could have been just going, yes, I'm totally, with the government's position, right? So this is, it's all basically unfolding as we go along. I mean, do you remember the very first stages of it all coming out, and you're seeing these videos from China with people dropping on the streets, and then like there's some weird, it's like your worst fear, the isolation of somebody dropping on the street, everyone ignoring them and then just letting that person lie to rot basically. And then there's more and more videos that keep on pumping out. Did you get that same thing that was going on? I don't know if you saw that on the social media front.
we we did. The media certainly was circulating that kind of footage. The problem is that anyone who espouses a radical point of view should have looked at that with skepticism, because the media always sensationalizes everything because that's its business model. So even during the earliest phases, the footage I was seeing, I treated with a degree of skepticism. It
Oh,
was
you
alarming
were
on
smart. Well,
body.
I think you were smarter than me. I think whatever the thing they were trying to do, I think it probably just hijacked the the repulsive lizard brain sort of thing in me, because I was looking at it thinking, shit, this is getting pretty serious already, right? And then and then I think very not too far away. We're talking about a matter of weeks or days afterwards. There was talks about flight and travel, and then whether I think, well, I don't know if it was Trump or somebody talked about shutting down the flights from China, or it was or something on those lines, right? That was the entrance point. And from my perspective, I was like, yeah, sure, shut down international flights. I was more than happy for that to sort of shut down, if as long as it's a temporary basis thing. But just from literally gathering just tiny grains of information, this looks pretty serious. Okay, we're going to shut down the international travel. Yeah, maybe let's go along with it. I was in that sort of state of mind as it's the early first couple of weeks as it transpired.
Yeah, and I don't think that's unreasonable because, and I don't mean to convey the impression that I was ahead of the population in terms of accurately ascertaining what was going on. These were just intuitions that I had, but I still felt, in the first month of the pandemic, that it was sensible to take certain measures, even if we were only gathering information, like you said, shutting down international travel. Like, pandemics are not without historical precedent. And if it actually was serious, then obviously you need to take measures to get a handle on things and then reassess. So I was not necessarily opposed to the first month limiting travel, putting in place certain ordinances to limit outdoor activity, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's
What?
only
Yeah.
after that it became clear that people were taking advantage of the situation, and by
Yeah.
people I mean the elites in many ways.
Yeah. So I think this is where the brain sort of started to think, okay, hold on a minute here. I might have been a little bit sort of gung ho with this. Is from an Australian perspective, they'll say, it's 1 week to crush the curve or whatever it is in that sort of situation. So you go, okay, we'll all us workers will work from home. We'll shut ourselves in, and then that'll be it. But I knew as soon as it was like, no, this may go on for longer, and I knew obviously the way you term it, right? They say, oh, it's just work. Don't worry about it. This is livelihood. It isn't just work. It's livelihood. It is the way to sustain, everything like that. And as soon as that sort of just went into they accelerated into there wasn't, and they said, no, it's going to be another week. That's where it all sort of clicked for me. I was like, yeah, here we go. Something's fishy now. And then obviously my years and mountains of watching conspiracy videos, now I knew all the the puzzle pieces sort of came into picture. And then that was then it wasn't really too much after that. I don't think that we started to get I know we can't really talk about it too much, but the answer to the problem, right? And you know, and then this is where I was like, okay, but there's alternatives. There's this and that. So it was a very tricky situation after that.
It was.
And
And
sorry, I'll let you continue.
no, it's okay. I was just going to add on a personal note that the way the timeline unfolded, you had said that they were framing it as it being not a big deal. It's just taking off work for a little while.
Yeah,
Well, in my own case, and I'm certainly not alone in this, I had just quit a job before the pandemic started, and I was about to start another job literally a week or two before the lockdown started. And So I was in between jobs, about to start a new job. The lockdown happened, and then when they lifted the lockdown, and I live in Florida, so we were fortunate in the sense we weren't under as draconian of policies as a lot of the rest of the country was.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, when I went to go back, that job was no longer there. The hiring manager had left. They weren't allowed to do that particular kind of work quite yet. So I was effectively without an income for several months.
Yeah, and
And that did really affect
and you're
me.
in America, right? So there isn't some massive welfare system to sweep you up or anything like
No,
that, right?
not at all.
so, so yeah. So as soon as that, yeah, so then as soon as I hear the livelihood, your way to sustain yourself, your family, and everything else was getting meddled with, I was like, this is this is it. This is the line in the sand now. Here we go. So and then I don't know if you saw any of the presenters on from Australia, but we had probably some of the most special politicians and special media people just continuously drumming it home. It went from when we're talking about the solution that they were just sort of from a male's perspective, the ego, come on, stop being a wussy or whatever, you just get it done sort of thing. And then from a female's perspective, it was just like I knew that there were just it was all people. Maybe they were hiring corporations from that were psychologists and stuff like that, but you could just tell that there was there was a methodology, and then basically all the different states here in Australia, it would transfer from one to the next state. So then it was just 20, like it seemed like 24 hours of them just browbeating you all throughout the day. It was, it was something special. Going back as well, when you was mentioning about the right wing side of things, the weird thing there was the speed up projects from Trump and how he authorized it, because that must have been a bit of a splitting moment for the right wing in itself. So you don't even know who to trust eventually at the same by the same edge, right? So yeah, okay, what wow, Trump's apparently he's a bit of a germist. He doesn't like germs, and he was always questioning what happened to kids with their schedule and everything else. But when it came to this, he was like warp speed. So that was very questionable. And then the corporations, to a lot of extents, for a lot of people, you either don't pay your mortgage, don't pay your bills, or you do it, and then you can sustain yourself.
Exactly. Trump's decision during the pandemic was definitely polarizing. And I also don't want to give the Republican right wing undue credit for being ahead of everyone, because in the earlier phases of the pandemic, a lot of them were just as credulous as the Democratic left was.
Yeah.
So there were really only a few voices in the periphery, people who would be dismissed as conspiracy theorists or radicals, or you cite your own euphemism here.
Yeah.
They were the ones who were trying to call attention to the excesses, to the potentially hazardous decisions that were being made. For my part, my entry point into a lot of my criticism started when it was obvious that the technocratic establishment was very averse to the lab leak hypothesis
Yeah.
for the origin of COVID-19. And when I saw that, how they just shut down any and all mention of it, I was like, oh, okay, so clearly in some capacity, the government and the pharmaceutical industry was complicit in the creation of this virus in the first place. And now they're trying to control the narrative so that we never get a sense of how this started, nor are we going to have access to key information in terms of how they choose to treat this phenomena that they are responsible for unleashing in the first place.
Yeah, so yeah, that the lab leak situation. Yeah, there's a lot of unanswered questions around all of that stuff. There's questions of timing as well, when it was released, whether people were getting picked up beforehand. There was another there was another situation. There was a bad outbreak. This is what was the triggering point for the week lockdowns. Was the situation in Italy and the situation in Iraq was quite bad. There was more video footage that came out, and that triggered a lot of countries after that start. As soon as they, saw it in, some European city, I think that was another triggering point, which kicked things off as well. I mean, so from my personal perspective, I never really questioned it that much before taking the schedule from early age and all that kind of stuff. For all I know now, it's probably given me all the different little elements of my life now, and where I'm having to, check in with the doctors. But I've never really questioned it in that way. But it was, there was a lot of things that are arousing suspicions. The very first thing, and obviously we know that all Western governments do work by the Five Eyes network, all those kind of things. There are secret sort of organizations, how they work in lockstep. But there was a very prominent lockstep that was going on. The only outliers from, say, Western countries was maybe like Sweden or Japan to a very small extent, but everything else was perfect, uniformed response, which, you can't argue that you've got independent governments that are working, individually on that front. I don't know whether you had this, but there was exemptions for politicians. There was exemptions for the distributors of the product. Even now to this day, if there's any inquiries that happen, it's all about if they lock down hard enough or not. It doesn't want to look into anything else. It's a very closed, shut case. Even, I don't know, you saw what happened from over here. If any medical person spoke out, there was, a lot of issues that person could encounter from, to the extent of being deregistered, right? If it wasn't speaking within the framework of what was, guided for the medical professionals. So, yeah, you can say to a certain extent, oh, well, we were just trying to do our best, and, we didn't know what we was dealing with, so we had to do this. I have heard this common argument as to say, well, if as a politician, if you do nothing, you lose regardless. You're better off doing something rather than nothing. So I understand that argument to a certain extent, but you could take a very libertarian attitude to things, right? This is the way I would, in retrospect, with, looking back at this whole situation, you would say as an announcement, look, I cannot, as a citizen, tell my fellow citizens to stop working. You've got to provide for your own families. That comes first, unfortunately. But I have to say that you're going to have to put forward every kind of provision to prevent this from spreading. And the government's going to provide you some guidance, and we're going to offer you some suggestions and alternatives that may help and may stop, the pandemic. This kind of assistance, right? And if things do get out of hand, you maybe need to level up in certain areas. But yeah, that's the way I would have thought this one out.
Yeah, and that's entirely reasonable as far as I'm concerned. I think the problem was that from the very beginning, the way that information was being controlled
Yeah.
and alternative points of view were being silenced prevented any such discussion from happening. They already had an agenda in place. And as a Marxist, I feel vindicated in a lot of this because it broke down along class lines quite often.
Yeah.
Like you said, there was always exceptions. So, in spite of all of the rhetoric and all of the draconian programs that were preventing people from working, there was always a segment of the population that had to work in order for this to happen anyway.
Yeah.
So there were quote unquote vital industries or essential workers that still needed to go out and actually enable the rest of the population to stay home effectively.
Yeah.
And they claimed they were exercising extraordinary measures to keep them safe, but they didn't really know how this virus spread or how dangerous it was. And the problem was those sensational headlines that we saw, like out of Spain and Italy, where we're seeing body bags and hospitals that seem overwhelmed. Like the treatment protocol that they had in place to begin with probably contributed to a lot of the mortality that we saw. So putting people on ventilators, for instance, probably led to a lot of unnecessary deaths because it's a very caustic form of treatment. But it was also clear early on that the most vulnerable people had comorbidities that pretty much any virus renders them vulnerable to. Like these same kind of people were susceptible to fatal consequences of getting the flu, for instance. We're talking about elderly, obese, really sick people.
Yeah.
And once that became evident, and I think it did early on, at least to medical professionals who were treating these people, we could have had a very sensible policy wherein we said, okay, the most vulnerable segments of our society, people that are in their 80s, who already have limited social lives as it is. It's not like they're working full-time jobs or going out that often. Keep them at home. If you suffer from a comorbidity, maybe you can sign an exemption and you can try to wait this out until we get a better handle on just how fatal or risky this virus is. So, something like that. And then let everyone else more or less continue as they had been.
Yeah, so, this, in a very, very, coming from a communist, you pretty much would tell the rich to put their feet up and, not contact as much, but obviously workers do need to work, right? You come from that perspective.
Sure,
it is, you are, there is this balancing act. You've got the livelihood on one side. You can't, you're not, as soon as you start saying, right, lockdown, pick winners and losers, there's going to be these people that are going to be financially gaining from the situation, these people that are not. And it's all it could be on the case of ethical and moral grounds as well, whether they choose to participate or not. It's it was a complete muck up. But here's the other one, right? And obviously, as soon as you hear this word, this is when the shit is going to hit the fan. As soon as they say emergency use powers, right? That's totally. Is the playbook, right? And so it happens in 9/11, right? The Patriot Act, and now we've pretty much created the surveillance state after that. It happens every single time, and I don't know. What is it like? Just going into the office or whatever, or just talking. The subject's never even raised. I don't think ever, unless you talk to somebody that's on your way of thinking. I don't think I've ever seen it brought up again. It's like some kind of Stockholm syndrome or something.
Yeah, you have to always keep in mind, Charles, that even when we live through these episodes where this becomes manifestly obvious to those of us who pay attention, the general population has a very short-term memory. And so most of us live through the governmental excesses of the Patriot Act and the war on terror, quote unquote, they didn't draw those associations when the pandemic happened, because again, most people's historical memory is very, very short term if they pay attention at all. Now, I don't know how many people in my own life I could say think of matters historically like that. It's probably within, I could probably count them on my hands, to be
I
honest
mean,
with you.
there was like even strange situations like around Christmas, whether you should have invite your, one of your family members because they haven't taken the product.
Yeah,
It's crazy, right? There was
it was
literally news that was coming
asinine.
out like over that kind of situation. But it was, it was
Yes.
getting to the state of ridiculousness, right? But it may have seemed absolutely ridiculous and obscene for us, but I think people were just, gulping it down and thinking, yeah, maybe I should question this thing and stuff. I don't know. I remember even seeing a video, right, where a lady's mourning the passing of her husband, and one of her sons has moved the chair closer to her to put his arm around it, and just that was somebody shouting, "No, stop this!" Right? It's obscene ridiculousness, right? At that stage, in the time scale of a pandemic, it's just getting ridiculous, right? Yeah, people, grandparents, literally, people couldn't say their dying words with each other. It wasn't even the ridiculous situations like that. Very, weird and complicated things were getting involved in the family, and I just don't like a certain point. There's a point at which the government just needs to leave people alone and not intrude their life to that extent, right? And it was going way far, way too far, way too deep. And the way people, gulped it up, I'm thinking, like, are we going to stick like this? This is ridiculous.
Yeah. What I found so dispiriting, I think, wasn't what the government was doing, because we can always expect them to seize any and all opportunities to augment their authority and power, and they always fall into excess. What was more alarming was how many people, credulous people, willingly went along with this and acted just as draconian as the most insufferable bureaucrat would. I saw it repeatedly, even in Florida, which, again, as far as the United States goes,
Yeah,
is
you're in a pretty good
pretty
place, right? Yeah.
libertarian. But some of the people here really went that far, and it became very hostile. Of course, eventually there was a pushback. Even among those people, I think they finally figured out, by the grace of God, that okay, we've been uh, operating in the wrong mode of thought here.
Yeah.
Like, the government went too far, and there was a corresponding response among the population. So that was good to see. It just took so long to get there.
So it could be a combination of things, but, if you think about dogs, right, they don't bite the hand that feeds. They very rarely attack the family because it's all of those dogs have been bred out basically, and all the rebellious people, all the war people, and the people that will fight and stand up and create revolutions. I don't know. Have they all been bred out of existence? Have they been all sent to jail so efficiently that there isn't really that much of a rebellious side of things? Well, I'd even go so far to say, particularly in Australia, it feels like, heroes are almost created. So you get these heroes that pop up out of nowhere, and then it's very questionable, like how they lean to certain political parties afterwards. It's very suspect, all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, I guess, the way that I was trying to to say is that the few, what does it really take for a revolt to happen, right? It seems that even if there was a revolt, it's going to be taken over by these it's not Asian provocateurs, but people that will just act as the hero that will lead you astray, and then you got social media checking up on you as well, or censor you and everything like that. I just don't think it is a time for heroes or people that will stand up on the soapbox and can lead things out of things. It's just the only ever way I can see anything changing is a decentralized movement now, really. I think the time of heroes and people that stand up is sort of over.
Well, I think part of the problem there is sociological in the sense that in late capitalism or late modernity, however you want to conceive of it, we've become so atomized that it's really difficult for a lot of people to think in terms of collective action altogether.
Yeah,
We're all kind of isolated and just trying to survive as individual units, right? So, thinking in terms of organizing beyond that is just so alien to our lived experiences now that I don't even think that those who possess intrinsic leadership qualities feel like they can effectively channel them in
yeah,
these kinds of situations. Then
yeah,
there's other theories about um, how the government over time has done its utmost to try to assimilate subversive elements into the state apparatus itself or into the corporate sector. So if you see exceptional individuals, a lot of them are extended opportunities, and then you can effectively neutralize them by making them part of the power elite
yeah,
anyway.
yeah. Put them into the bourgeoisie and stuff, right? And then obviously,
Exactly.
it didn't really help that everyone was in living in a state of isolation for so long, right? And the what is the hardest sort of source of punishment in a prison is they send you to the hole. The isolation is the thing that really shatters the brain into a certain extent. So yeah, it you could say they did a very very good convincing job if there was a program behind it, right? That isolation was the perfect thing to do, and I honestly think if there is going to be anything that happens around the corner, whether it be currency reset, global climate, cyber warfare, whatever, I reckon that there has to be that isolation component because that was just so powerful above all the weapons that you could ever create, more so than any kind of terrorist event or anything like that. The isolation that moves the populace, I think, was just beyond anything that I could ever imagine. And obviously, they had the ear to control people as well.
They did. And the repercussions for that long term isolation, I think, are going to be with us for a while. I was fortunate in the sense that I continued to more or less live life as I had been, in spite of the absurd mask mandates, in spite of the vaccine requirements. I pretty much lived my life without acknowledging any of that. It was challenging at times. I traveled, I did not social distance, I didn't do any of that. And, occasionally you'd be met with some resistance by some arbitrary person in public, but I mean, they're paper tigers. The second you push back, they would back off.
Yeah,
This kind of mass conformity, if you're sufficiently strong-willed, is not going to affect you that much. It's when the state intervenes and tries to arrest you, those kinds of things.
yeah,
And I think that I was just having this discussion with someone recently that when it comes to some of the more draconian plans that I think they were eager to try to implement but didn't get around to, we always have to think structurally about some of this. So you had mentioned a currency reset, and the person who I was talking to had brought up um, digital currencies
yeah,
and medical ID chips and those kinds of things. What I tried to explain to them, and this is as a Marxist what I earnestly believe, the bourgeoisie is not of a uniform opinion. So there's a lot of different power brokers, and they kind of fall along partisan lines. So you have like the George Soros and Bill Gates among the progressive technocratic elite, and then you
Yeah.
have, say, the Elon Musks around the conservative technocratic elite.
Yeah.
And they have different ideas as how to best manage the population. And so they'll come up with certain policy proposals, right? They'll throw it out there. The problem is not all of them are actually functional with how the system works. So the currency exists as it does because it has a functional utility for the process of capital accumulation as capitalism is currently configured. So if you try to have some kind of great reset, to quote the Global Economic Forum weirdos,
Yeah.
that's going to be very destabilizing for the economy. And there's going to be resistance to that among the elite itself. So we have to be kind of weary as to what we think the next move is going to be,
Yeah.
because it's not at all clear. And they might try something and then back off because it becomes obvious that it's just too destabilizing.
Because there's a lot of there's a lot of winners and losers that are going to come out of that one, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm it's a very tricky thing to to say what is going on, where is the hidden hand. I mean, just off the top of the head, I'd say as well, this is the weird one that happened in it is the economic component of the pandemic. It just generated so much demand. Everyone was whatever ordering things on Amazon and stuff like that, but nothing. There was no ability for anything to be produced at that moment. So the market function of capitalism or whatever this modern day era thing is, it got crushed. And then on the backbone of it as well, the housing market, I don't know if it was initially, probably didn't do too well at the start, but then it did have a massive ride up afterwards. So in the middle of this orchestration, one of the assets that the elites don't want to crash, because obviously that would and if you could think of any kind of situation that would have done it, it would have been probably a pandemic. But the actual pandemic just held up and sustained pretty much every asset's price. It went almost into a just a demand driven situation. And the enjoyable thing, and you must have enjoyed this as well, I don't know if you quite experienced this as much, but the high demand for labor, how much of a luxury that was, where labor was in demand and we weren't hyper competitive against everybody. And there's a bit of a fight for good decent workers, and decent pay was being offered more and more. Obviously, we're in Australia now, so they just open the gates to unlimited immigration now. So it's a competitive dog eat dog world again. But I don't know how those little mechanics of economics happened through that pandemic. What do you think about those
That
parts?
was interesting. So on the labor side of the equation, it was the first time in living memory where I saw even unskilled labor fetch a premium after the economy opened up again.
Yeah.
And it was really just, a matter of supply and demand. And seeing the resistance to that from the capitalists themselves was amusing, because they were beside themselves during all of that.
Yeah.
And
Landlords as well, offering cheaper rents. All of that was going on.
well, that had comparatively less of an impact, at least where in the communities that I live in and in Florida in general. Like, the rents have always been pretty high, and the fall off was really, really moderate, and it quickly resumed high rent status shortly thereafter. So that wasn't as much of an impact. But the problem was, I knew as soon as labor had a little leverage, that was going to contribute to the inflation that we're now seeing.
Yeah.
Because if you combine that with the supply chain disruption that you had mentioned, it was obviously going to be a problem before long. So whatever victories labor got temporarily were quickly subsumed with the inflation we saw in reaction to this. And then what I also found interesting was the intra-class conflict among the bourgeoisie itself. So you had mentioned, like, during the lockdowns, some industries did well. So you had those like capital intensive merchants like Amazon
Yeah,
do okay during the pandemic. Some of their profits rose, but the supply chain issue was also a factor they had to contend with. But a lot of brick and mortar small businesses suffered. I went to New York City a few times during the pandemic, and the first time out, it was really eerie because it was kind of early on, and so many small businesses were boarded up and never came back. Restaurants, small shops,
yeah.
those kinds of things. The second time I
So,
went, I
which I
saw
think is totally disgraceful, right? How
it is, yeah,
does a government get to pick and choose like that?
exactly. Well, because those capitalists, by way of comparison, exercise very little power in the government because they don't have the means to, because those are uh, sectors of the economy and industries that just have low margins and they don't have powerful lobbyists to go work on their behalf in Washington and do
Yeah,
the necessary rent seeking uh, lubricant that the corporations do.
yeah,
So they were at a disadvantage from the very beginning. And it wasn't just the capitalists themselves, but everybody that worked at those businesses. It was a disaster for a lot of people, including myself.
yeah.
So that was also interesting to see.
Yeah, well, even this other weird stuff like so. Yeah, you'll like this one. So I even got into sort of like this weird sort of groups of like luxury watches and stuff like that. I never even participated in buying a luxury watch, but it was just a weird world to enter into, and how it is a lot of all this vanity stuff. But we're all just living in these little watching things online and stuff like that, and everyone's just what the word I forgot the word, but you're flaunting your stuff and all this kind of stuff, and the luxury
Status signaling.
the luxury watch market's kicked off on the back of things like that, and you wouldn't even consider weird things like that. It would be the last thing I would ever suggest is going to go up in a market during the pandemic, like luxury watches. I think that would be I'll say that was definitely number one thing to crash, because it's going. This is now about important things, but it almost in some ways things got perverted because of the way that the money was messed around with, and how people had too much idle time to do nothing at all other than watch other people flaunt their stuff, and then
Yeah.
it created all these weird perversions in the end.
Yeah, a lot of counterintuitive things emerged in the course of that social isolation, and a lot of niche markets developed, like you said, luxury watches. It is a lot of social pathologies develop when you isolate people for that long, because, as you had alluded to earlier, humans are a very social species. So if you put them in isolation long enough, they're going to act in really erratic, unpredictable ways. And I think that's why we saw these strange phenomena
Yeah,
of niche status signaling markets emerging and conspicuous consumption happening in spite of the fact there was, relatively speaking, little in the way of income for people. But yeah, I mean, that was eye opening, to be sure. Like,
yeah.
I didn't forecast that,
No,
but
and then straight after that as well, the boom was vacations, right? I'm sure being in
oh
Florida,
yeah.
you must have noticed everyone going to the theme parks after that, right? As soon
Oh
as
yeah,
yeah,
people. So many
I
people
need to have
were
my time off,
flooding
right?
our
Yeah,
shores. Yeah, like in fact, the real estate boom that happened where I live in Florida was interesting. A lot of people made a lot of money during that are involved in construction and development. And one of the things that I saw a lot of was a lot of businesses transition to remote work.
yeah,
And so brick and mortar became passe, and it gave these workers the freedom of movement in a lot of ways, and they decided to come to Florida among other places. And so our real estate market went crazy.
Yeah.
And where I live, almost every other person you meet
Well,
is a
but if
real
people
estate
can't get a,
agent.
if people can't get a job, that
Yeah.
it's it's the place to go to, right? Isn't it?
Fair enough. Yeah, like they find it aesthetically enjoyable here. I couldn't begrudge anyone that, to be sure. And so then the laws of supply and demand being what they are, the real estate market in general, as of late, is problematic. These remote workers I'm referring to have high salaries, and so they can pay the premium that real estate developers in Florida charge. But in as far as the supply of affordable housing, not just in the United States, but throughout the developed world, it kind of in a crisis mode there.
Yeah. I was listening to something today actually. It was talking about the value in three major things, and it was one was in labor and one was in capital. But in the old books, they defined two things with capital, like capital equipment, but then there was also land. But they sort of erased the land component as being an individual entity in itself, and they were just saying it was just labor and capital. And that's confused a lot of economics going forward.
Yeah,
And
the classical political economists had a very hostile view of landlords and rents. I think Adam Smith, for instance, and maybe even Ricardo, they were under the impression that that was going to become an anachronism. They thought that was kind of a hangover from the feudal era.
yeah,
And somehow capitalism was going to overcome it. They were always kind of vague about that, but they didn't really factor it into their analysis much.
yeah. Well, once you start talking about land, there is an advantage, right? There's an advantage to be close proximity to your workplace. There is an advantage to the fact that you can grow food on that land. It produces, livestock can be on your land. You can hunt things on the land. It is it's not a very accurately, factored component. And then obviously, the government has got this amazing ability to convert land and rezone it and sell it in parcels and create these, booms in properties and the land value. It's just one of those weird equations of land value that never really gets mentioned that much.
That's true. As a libertarian, I don't know if you've read much of his work, but you might find Henry George interesting.
The Welsh guy, yeah?
No, he was an American economist, if I remember correctly. And he was an early libertarian, but he was one of the libertarians that a lot of socialists and communists took seriously because what he was writing about kind of intersects with our own views of land.
Yeah.
But I would recommend looking into his writings because this is a question he really committed himself to specifically. And he developed interesting proposals that are consistent with a libertarian political philosophy and with a communist political philosophy, kind of like occupied both spaces in an interesting way. A lot of it had to do with land value taxation and his thoughts on that. So very interesting writer. That's just an aside. I don't mean to.
Yeah, no, that's good. So we did have about five other topics, but I do need to drop off in the next 10-ish minutes. I just want to give us one little snippet of, just a question that I really wanted to ask you. That's going to just jump into one of the subjects in the future. So the Labour theory of value, right? Where does AI come into this equation?
I guess it depends on what one assumes AI is capable of.
Yeah.
So I am a strong AI skeptic. I think that a lot of the forecasting that analysts are doing for AI is just not going to materialize. I believe that the kind of weak AI that we're seeing, which is just effectively amassing large databases and then working from those, that's going to develop at a reasonable pace. But that's not going to, the economic impact is not going to be that dire as a consequence of that. When you start entertaining ideas of strong AI, where we're talking about actual artificial intelligence, thinking and learning, that could have serious ramifications if we take the labor theory of value as being operated in political economy.
Yeah.
So the theory would be that to the extent that human labor power is replaced, and it always is in the processes of economic development.
But
The pro-
this. Sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to see if I can still man your case. Does this really change too much from the fact that farmers work in the land to, people now working in factories with tools and industrial revolution and things like that? So now that you've got extra tools now at your disposal, it doesn't really change too much from the farmland to the industrial land to the office land, with tech as an advantage now to play with.
no, like, so what we've seen historically is that the technologies that were developed, while they were temporarily disruptive, they didn't really have an impact in terms of rendering labor as such redundant. What we saw was a reorganizing of labor. So people went from agricultural labor to industrial labor
Yeah.
during the Industrial Revolution. And then within the Industrial Revolution, there's periodic shifts as well. But most of the major innovations that occurred really just shifted labor around. The danger happens as far as a Marxist who espouses the labor theory of value is once you develop a technology that doesn't shift labor around productively anymore, what it does is it renders it entirely superfluous. That's a problem because once you exclude laborers, the value of the commodities that are being generated necessarily falls. And so that is where you would see economic distortions and potentially crisis for capitalism.
Yeah. I know where you're coming from. So you do see, if it does have that potential, it does have like a threat element. I've always formed a view that AI would be a tool. I don't like the idea of Elon Musk's, connected into your brain kind of thing, like the Matrix or whatever. But
No.
I do happen to think that, AI is a tool. It is a tool to be used as, we could at some stage, you could be producing a fully fledged council communist movie, right? For all we know, and with AI's assistance, and you can countervey your view much better than ever before. The recipients of all of the products that that we provide for, the only people that can understand those recipients are the producers that are human beings. AI doesn't know how a human feels about anything, right? If you created a movie, it happens to touch you on certain levels and frequencies and things like that no other AI can quite comprehend. So that's the way I see a lot of this, the flow moving, right? I guess we're moving further and further away from pure hard gritty labor, and now we're moving into some we're getting into this. There's always going to be labor required. I don't think you're going to completely remove it, but I do think like this AI revolution is a bit weird, right? It seems like the office worker is going to be knocked out first, and to some weird degree, the artist is getting knocked out as well. The attack vectors of the AI is the weirdest way. Whereas I was thinking maybe the truck driver was going to get knocked out first, but that seems to be still way off.
Yeah, those kinds of innovations are still way off. And I think that brings to bear on the question as to just what we can expect from these kinds of technologies. I don't know whether or not that will be something that we see within our lifetime. Self-driving vehicles. All the experiments so far have been pretty dismal from what I've seen. The results are just not impressive and sometimes very disturbing.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's something we need to worry about in the near future. This again, we have to really start questioning our assumptions about what we can program machines to do effectively. So far, what we've seen historically is that very rote mechanical tasks we can rely on machines to do. And now with this soft AI technology, we can have databases, algorithms that can produce interesting things, but they still require human inputs in a lot of ways. So without that, you have a hard limit there. And that might have ramifications for certain sectors of the economy, to be sure. But I don't think we're at a critical mass
Yeah.
quite yet.
Yeah.
But
Sorry.
for the labor theory of value to be meaningful, we don't even really need to postulate strong AI or even much in the way of AI at all. Like this, the labor theory of value is pertinent just in the normal course of capitalist technological development. But since you brought up AI specifically in reference to it, yeah, so far I'm not seeing it being too problematic for capitalism. But I mean, we're witnessing a lot in these. Do we live in interesting times, Charles? So it's
Yeah.
hard for me to really
Well, look, I'll give you
pontificate on it.
I'll give you a strange one, right? So the pandemic could be something that is to do with AI, right? In terms of the fact that the labor force isn't so much required anymore, and the AI as well. So if you think about so how we survive and reproduce is by the fact that the best humans that can provide the best resources, create the families and reproduce, right? So we've had, strong workers, farmers, maybe military people that have done very well to rule over lands, and that's produced a certain type of human. Then we've gone to the industrial revolution, and to a certain extent, you could say that's kind of dumbed us down to a certain degree, because we've all been isolated into certain little widgets and stuff to do certain little roles, rather than tending to entire farm for the Lord or whatever. And now it seems like we're getting into a stage where, I don't know, it's like it's either you're going to be some very high end artist of some kind, or ideologist of some kind, and then, but I don't even know how much with the way that the censorship's going and all that kind of stuff, how much ideologists or politically minded artists are going to fare in this world. And then on the other
How
end,
many of those do we really need?
yeah,
You
and
know?
then on the other end, right? You've got, you just look at India or Pakistan. There's like people that are having like 10 children. The AI has got very little, or computers have got very little to do with their lives. You got a couple of people that have got mobile phones, but it ain't the be all and end all of life, right? There's a lot more population in the world that just doesn't have this kind of technology, or whether it's relevant or not to them or not. So
Yeah,
I don't know.
it's something to consider, and I'm of two minds here. So a Marxist would describe the process that you're detailing here as alienation.
Yeah,
So we have, because it's part of our philosophical anthropology that human beings are creative animals. Like we are in our element when we are involved in unexploited labor. right? That's what makes us unique as human beings. One of the many things that makes us unique as a species is our ability to cooperatively labor, and do so creatively at times. And Adam Smith was the first economist to draw attention to the hazards of the division of labor that capitalism was introducing. So, on the one hand, he praised it because that's why we became so productive so quickly. But the division of labor, unchecked, leads to us specializing in these very rote, mundane tasks. And you said that can have a corresponding dumbing down effect. And
Yeah.
AI is only going to accelerate that all the more. And then what are you left with? So, the communist idea was that to the extent that we can automate labor processes, we should prioritize automating those which are comparatively mundane or dangerous, like the kinds of things that nobody really wants to do anyway.
Yeah.
Automate those, but when we're making those decisions, make sure that we don't automate the kind of labor that we actually enjoy doing. And then Karl Marx, he had kind of a romantic notion that, we would, once our productivity rose to a certain level, it would give human beings more leisure time. And in their leisure time, since we're such a creative species anyway, we would actually go back and do some artisanal forms of labor as our pastime, like wooden
You're thinking exactly the
craftsmanship.
same as
Like,
what I'm sort of thinking at this moment.
yeah,
Have you
like
heard
we
of
find that
steampunk?
fulfilling. I'm sorry.
Have you heard of steampunk?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So apparently, in some theories and things I've read on beforehand, is that as we become so technologically advanced, and how the Apple iPhones just become just like a liquid space sort of cube that just has nothing. You don't know the mechanics behind it. It's just an enigma, right? And the revolt of this is to revert ourselves, even though how technologically advanced we may be, but we want to know the mechanisms and the way, the steam drive things and stuff like that, and reverting back away from such a, everything's bloody plugged in with Wi-Fi and everything else. You want to know the mechanisms, you understand it, you're adding a little bit of your own inspiration, your own art, your own your own personal thoughts into the engineering of things, rather than letting AI do it all for you.
Right. Something creative that we can wrap our minds around, that we don't need this really intricate global supply chain to facilitate.
Yeah.
Something that we could actually do on a local level and find interesting and enjoyable. And that was what Karl Marx was getting at when he made these allusions to returning to artisanal craftsmanship, skilled labor from the past, just for its own sake, because we find it interesting. And it's kind of a connection to our ancestors. There's a spiritual dimension to all of this as well that I think
Yeah.
we shouldn't overlook.
Yeah, no, that is that is amazing. I mean, look, I would love to continue at this stage, and AI is just not even, and even the pandemic, we probably could have gone in for a lot more of digging around, but
Sure.
I'm going to have to probably hold us at this point here. We can re-enter this subject log that we're going to go through anyway at some later stage, just to continue this and complete the recap that we're trying to do here. But it's been amazing so far, as always. So Michael, what's the main areas that we find you nowadays? I noticed that you did a really good just a podcast recently with some kind of British academic. I forgot his name, but he was quite interesting. What was that about? That was on your Common Ruin podcast, is that right?
Yeah, so since you and I had last spoke, I guess 2 years ago now, I had started a podcast to complement the work I had been doing on my blog. So that, me, like I tend to gravitate towards the theoretical side of communist political philosophy. So I've been working a lot and refining my own thoughts and theories. And I thought the podcast could be a good opportunity to bring on some of the academics that have been influencing me over the years. And so most recently, I had recorded a discussion with a British computer scientist, Paul Cockshott, who is one of the few living academicians that has been involved in theorizing new techniques of economic planning.
Yeah, it really,
Um,
yeah, I listen to so much and it's just an empty, nothingness. And I'm listening to somebody, I get frustrated after 5 minutes now with listening to people just, go nowhere. But this was, genuinely interesting stuff, like things I'd never really heard of before.
oh, excellent. Well, I'm glad you found resonance in it. You inspired me in a lot of ways to start the podcast because I always found our discussions very engaging. So I thought it would be a good moment. And you and I
Yeah,
had even talked about it in the past. I remember you had encouraged me to consider that direction of things. So I
yeah.
finally went for it. So if anyone listening is curious, they can find the Common Ruin podcast on Spotify or all of the other major podcast apps.
Yeah.
So
Get
I
yourself on.
and hopefully I can get you on there one day too,
Yeah,
Charles.
yeah, that'd be good. And also Substack. Have you heard of that one as well? I think that's
Yeah,
pretty
yeah.
good.
So I don't have a Substack yet. I have a Patreon, and I uploaded maybe one or two of my articles on Medium.
Yeah,
But Substack seems to be the way a lot of people are going. I think it's a great
yeah.
medium.
And then X as well. You might as well give that a roll of the dice.
Oh yeah, I've got a small X account that I I don't post in too often, but I mean the discourse is there. It's very charged and funny, but but yeah, like I'll probably try to give that a go a little bit more.
All right, awesome. Okay, well, yeah, thanks for your time anyway, Mike. We'll have another catch up there. Just to let everybody know, we do have some other topics of social justice movements, AI. I think we probably still need to have a little bit more of a coverage of censorship, immigration, war tensions, and yeah, the Great Reset. I guess we've had a little bit of a touch on those subjects, but I think we're going to try and see if we can cover them in the next episode. If not, we're going to be possibly doing a couple more.
Excellent. I look forward to it.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Charles.